This is Whispers Inc. I wanted to welcome you back to the continuation of Pride and Prejudice. Today I'm going to read chapters 7 and 8, and I hope you enjoy. Mr. Bennet's property consisted almost entirely in an estate of $2,000 a year, which, unfortunately for his daughters, was entailed, in default of heirs male, on a distant relation, and their mother's fortune, though ample for her situation in life, could but ill supply the deficiency of his. Her father had been an attorney in Myreton, and had left her £4,000. She had a sister married to a Mr. Phillips, who had been a clerk to their father and succeeded him in the business, and a brother settled in London in a respectable line of trade. The village of Longbourn was only 1 mile from Myreton, a most convenient distance for the young ladies, who were usually tempted thither 3 or 4 times a week, to pay their duty to their aunt and to a milliner's shop just over the way. The 2 youngest of the family, Catherine and Lydia, were particularly frequent in these attentions. Their minds were more vacant than their sisters', and when nothing better offered, a walk to Myreton was necessary to amuse their morning hours and furnish conversation for the evening. And however bare of news the country in general might be, they always contrived to learn some from their aunt. At present, indeed, they were all well supplied both with news and happiness by the recent arrival of a militia regiment in the neighborhood. It was to remain the whole winter, and Myreton was the headquarters. Their visits to Mrs. Phillips were now productive of the most interesting intelligence. Every day added something to their knowledge of the officers' names and connections. Their lodgings were not long a secret, and at length they began to know the officers themselves. Mr. Phillips visited them all, and this opened to his nieces a store of felicity unknown before. They could talk of nothing but officers, and Mr. Bingley's large fortune, the mention of which gave animation to their mother, was worthless in their eyes when opposed to the regimentals of an ensign. After listening one morning to their effusions on this subject, Mr. Bennet coolly observed, "From all that I can collect by your manner of talking, you must be 2 of the silliest girls in the country. I have suspected it some time, but I am now convinced." Catherine was disconcerted and made no answer, but Lydia, with perfect indifference, continued to express her admiration of Captain Carter, and her hope of seeing him in the course of the day, as he was going the next morning to London. "I am astonished, my dear," said Mrs. Bennet, "that you should be so ready to think your own children silly. If I wish to think slightingly of anybody's children, it should not be of my own, however. If my children are silly, I must hope to be always sensible of it. Yes, but as it happens, they are all of them very clever. This is the only point, I flatter myself, on which we do not agree. I had hoped that our sentiments coincided in every particular, but I must so far differ from you as to think our 2 youngest daughters uncommonly foolish." "My dear Mr. Bennet, you must not expect such girls to have the sense of their mother and father. When they get to our age, I dare say they will not think about officers any more than we do. I remember the time when I liked a red coat myself very well, and, indeed, so I do still at my heart. And if a small young colonel, with 5,000 or 6,000 a year, should want one of my girls, I shall not say nay to him. And I thought Colonel Forster looked very becoming the other night at Sir Williams's in his regimentals." "Mamma," cried Lydia, "my aunt says that Colonel Forster and Captain Carter do not go so often to Miss Watson's as they did when they first came. She sees them now very often standing in Clark's library." Mrs. Bennet was prevented replying by the entrance of the footman with a note for Miss Bennet. It came from Netherfield, and the servant waited for an answer. Mrs. Bennet's eyes sparkled with pleasure, and she was eagerly calling out while her daughter read. "Well, Jane, who is it from? What is it about? What does he say? Well, Jane, Make haste and tell us. Make haste, my love." "It is from Miss Bingley," said Jane, and then read it aloud. "My dear friend, if you are not so compassionate as to dine today with Louisa and me, we shall be in danger of hating each other for the rest of our lives, for a whole day's tete-a-tete between two women can never end without a quarrel. Come as soon as you can on receipt of this. My brother and the gentlemen are to dine with the officers. Yours ever, Caroline Bingley." "With the officers!" cried Lydia. "I wonder my aunt did not tell us of that." "Dining out?" said Mrs. Bennet. "That is very unlucky." "Can I have the carriage?" said Jane. "No, my dear, you had better go on horseback, because it seems likely to rain, and then you must stay all night." "That would be a good scheme," said Elizabeth, "if you were sure that they would not offer to send her home." "Oh, but the gentlemen will have Mr. Bingley's chaise to go to Meryton, and the Hursts have no horses to theirs. I had much rather go in the coach. But, my dear, your father cannot spare the horses, I am sure. They are wanted in the farm. Mr. Bennet, are they not?" "They are wanted in the farm much oftener than I can get them." "But if you have got them today," said Elizabeth, "my mother's purpose will be answered." She did at last extort from her father an acknowledgment that the horses were engaged. Jane was therefore obliged to go on horseback, and her mother attended her to the door with many cheerful prognostics of a bad day. Her hopes were answered. Jane had not been gone long before it rained hard. Her sisters were uneasy for her, but her mother was delighted. The rain continued the whole evening without intermission. Jane certainly could not come back. "This was a lucky idea of mine, indeed," said Mrs. Bennet more than once, as if the credit of making it rain were all her own. Till the next morning, however, she was not aware of all the felicity of her contrivance. Breakfast was scarcely over when a servant from Netherfield brought the following note for Elizabeth. "My dearest Lizzie, I find myself very unwell this morning, which, I suppose, is to be imputed to my getting wet through yesterday. My kind friends will not hear of me returning till I am better. They insist also on my seeing Mr. Jones, therefore do not be alarmed if you should hear of his having been to me, and, excepting a sore throat and a headache, there is not much to matter with me. Yours, etc." "Well, my dear," said Mr. Bennet, when Elizabeth had read the
was
note
convinced
aloud,
that they held her in
"if your
contempt
daughter
for
should
it.
have a dangerous fit
She
of
was
illness,
received,
if she should
however,
die,
very
it would be a
politely by
comfort
them,
to know that it
and
was
in their
all in
brother's
pursuit of
manners
Mr.
there was
Bingley,
something better than politeness,
and under your orders.
There was a good humor
Oh,
and kindness.
I'm not afraid of her dying.
Mr. Darcy said
People do
very
not
little,
die of
and
little
Mr. Hurst
trifling
nothing at all.
colds. She will be
The former
taken
was
good
divided
care of.
between admiration
As long as she stays
of the
there,
brilliancy which
it is all very
exercise
well.
had given to her
I would
complexion,
go and see her if I could
and
have the
doubt as to
carriage.
occasions justifying her coming
Elizabeth,
so far
feeling
alone.
really anxious,
The
was
latter
determined to go
thinking
to her,
only of his breakfast.
though the carriage was not to be had, and
Her
as she was no
inquiries after her
horsewoman,
sister were
walking
not
was her
very
only
favourably
alternative.
answered.
She
Miss
declared
Bennet
her
had slept
resolution.
ill, and though
"How
up,
can you be
was
so
very
silly?"
feverish,
cried her
and
mother.
not well enough to leave
"As
her
to
room.
think of such a thing.
Elizabeth
all
was
this
glad to be
dirt.
taken to her
You will
immediately,
not be fit to be
and
seen when you
Jane,
get there.
who had only been withheld by
I shall
a
be
fear
very
of giving
fit to see
alarm
Jane,
or
which is all I want.
inconvenience,
From expressing
Is
this
this a
a hint
note?
to me, Lizzie,"
how much she
said her
longed
father,
for such a visit,
"to send for
was
the
delighted
horses.
at her entrance.
No, indeed. I do
She
not
was
wish to
not
avoid the
equal,
walk.
however,
The
to
distance
much
is nothing.
conversation,
When one
and
has a
when
motive,
Bingley left them
only
together,
3 miles,
could
I
have
shall be
kept
little
little
by dinner.
besides expressions of gratitude.
I
for
admire the
extraordinary
activity of your
kindness she was
benevolence,"
treated with.
observed Mary, "but
Elizabeth
every impulse of
silently
feeling should be
attended
guided
her.
by reason, and, in my opinion, exertion
When
should
breakfast
always
was
be in
over,
proportion
they were
to what
joined
it
by
is
the
required.
sisters, and Elizabeth began
"We will
to
go
like
as far
them
as
herself.
Meryton with you," said Catherine
When she saw
to
how
Lydia.
much attention and
Elizabeth
solicitude they
accepted
showed
their
for Jane,
company, and the three
the
apothecary
apothecary
set
came,
off together.
and having examined his patient,
"If we make
said,
haste," said Lydia,
as might be
as they walked
supposed,
along,
that she had
"perhaps
caught
we
a
may
violent
see
cold,
something of Captain
and they
Carter
must
before he
endeavour to get
goes."
the better of it. Advised her to
In
return to
Meryton they
bed,
parted,
and
the two
promised her
youngest
some
repaired to
drops.
the lodgings of one of the officers'
The
wives.
advice was followed
and
readily,
Elizabeth
for the
continued her
feverish
walk
symptoms
alone,
increased,
crossing field
her
after
head
field
ached
at a
acutely.
quick pace.
Jumping
Elizabeth
over
did not
stiles
quit her
and
room
springing
for
over
a
puddles with
nor
impatient
were the other
activity,
ladies often absent,
and finding herself
the
at
gentlemen
last
being
within
out
view of the house,
they had, with weary
in
intervals,
fact,
dirty
nothing to do
stockings,
elsewhere.
and a face glowing with the warmth of exercise.
When the clock struck 3,
Elizabeth felt that she must
She
go.
was shown into
and
the
very
breakfast
when dinner
parlour
was over,
where all but
she
Jane
returned
was
directly to
Miss
Spain
Bingley
and
offered
offered
her the
the occasionally
occasionally
surprised
a little
she went to
that she should have walked 3
When
miles
Jane's
from early
manners
manners
were
were
pronounced
in
such
such
very
dirty
bad
weather
indeed,
that Miss
and by
Bingley
her
was
some
obliged
mixture
to
of
was
pride
almost
and
incredible
shame,
to
Mrs.
invitation.
Hurst
She had
had
no
no
commendation
composition
for the
no
present,
style.
no beauty.
Elizabeth most thankfully
Mrs. Hurst
consented,
thought the same,
and a servant
and
was
added,
dispatched to Longbourn to acquaint the
She
family
has
with her
nothing,
stay, and
in
in short,
supply of
to
clothes.
recommend her, but being an excellent walker. I shall never forget her appearance this morning. She really looked almost wild. She did indeed, Louisa. I could hardly keep my countenance. Very nonsensical to come at all. Why must she be scampering about the country? Because her sister had a cold? Her hair, so untidy, so blousy. Yes, and her petticoat. I hope you saw her petticoat. 6 inches deep in mud, I am absolutely certain, and the gown which had been let down to hide it not doing its office. Your picture may be very exact, Louisa, said Bingley, but this was all lost upon me. I thought Miss Elizabeth Bennet looked remarkably well when she came into the room this morning. Her dirty petticoat quite escaped my notice. You observed it, Mr. Darcy, I am sure, said Miss Bingley, and I am inclined to think that you would not wish to see your sister make such an exhibition. Certainly not. To walk 3 miles, or 4 miles, or 5 miles, or whatever it is, above her ankles in dirt, and alone, quite alone. What could she mean by it? It seems to me to show an abominable sort of conceited independence, a most country town indifference to decorum. It shows an affection for her sister that is very pleasing, said Bingley. I am afraid, Mr. Darcy, observed Miss Bingley in a half-whisper, that this adventure has rather affected your admiration of her fine eyes. Not at all, he replied. They were brightened by the exercise. A short pause followed this speech, and Mrs. Hurst began again. I have an excessive regard for Miss Jane Bennet. She is really a very sweet girl, and I wish with all my heart she were well settled. But with such a father and mother, and such low connections, I am afraid there is no chance of it. I think I have heard you say that their uncle is an attorney in Meryton. Yes, and they have another who lives somewhere near Cheapside. That is a capital, added her sister, and they both laughed heartily. If they had uncles enough to fill all Cheapside, cried Bingley, it would not make them one jot less agreeable. But it must very materially lessen their chance of marrying men of any consideration in the world, replied Darcy. To this speech Bingley made no answer, but his sisters gave it their hearty assent and indulged their mirth for some time at the expense of their dear friend's vulgar relations. With a renewal of tenderness, however, they returned to her room on leaving the dining parlour, and sat with her till summoned to coffee. Your sister, she was still very pleasant, and Elizabeth would not quit her
and
at
I
all,
hope it will be soon
till
increased
late in the
by
evening,
seeing her quite well.
when she had the comfort of seeing her sleep.
Elizabeth thanked him from
And
her
when
heart,
it seemed to her
and then
rather
walked towards
right
the
than
table
pleasant
where a few books were
that she
lying.
should go downstairs
He
herself,
immediately
offered to fetch her others all that his library afforded. And I wish my collection were larger for your benefit and my own credit, but I am an idle fellow, and though I have not many, I have more than I ever looked into. Elizabeth assured him that she could suit herself perfectly with those in the room. I am astonished, said Miss Bingley, that my father should have left so small a collection of books. What a delightful library you have at Pemberley, Mr. Darcy. It ought to be good, he replied. It has been the work of many generations. And then you have added so much to it yourself. You are always buying books. I cannot comprehend the neglect of a family library in such days of these. Neglect? I am sure you neglect nothing that can add to the beauties of that noble place. Charles, when you build your house, I wish it may be half as delightful as Pemberley. I wish it may. But I would really advise you to make your purchase in that neighborhood, and take Pemberley for a kind of model. There is not a finer county in England than Derbyshire. With all my heart, I will buy Pemberley itself if Darcy will sell it. I am talking of possibilities, Charles. Upon my word, Caroline, I should think it more possible to get Pemberley by purchase than by imitation. Elizabeth was so much caught with what passed as to leave her very little attention for her book, and soon laying it wholly aside, she drew near the card table and stationed herself between Mr. Bingley and his eldest sister to observe the game. "Is Miss Darcy much grown since the spring?" said Miss Bingley. "Will she be as tall as I am?" "I think she will. She is now about Miss Elizabeth Bennet's height, or rather taller." "How I long to see her again. I never met with anybody who delighted me so much. Such a countenance, such manners, and so extremely accomplished for her age. Her performance on the pianoforte is exquisite." "It is amazing to me," said Bingley, "how young ladies can have patience to be so very accomplished as they all are." "All young ladies accomplished, my dear Charles? What do you mean?" "Yes, all of them, I think. They all paint tables, cover screens, and net purses. I scarcely know anyone who cannot do all this, and I am sure I never heard a young lady spoken of for the first time without being informed that she was very accomplished." "Your list of the common extent of accomplishments," said Darcy, "has too much truth. The word is applied to many a woman who deserves it no otherwise than by netting a purse or covering a screen. But I am very far from agreeing with you in your estimation of ladies in general. I cannot boast of knowing more than half a dozen, in the whole range of my acquaintance, that are really accomplished." "Nor I am sure," said Miss Bingley. "Then," observed Elizabeth, "you must comprehend a great deal in your idea of an accomplished woman." "Yes, I do comprehend a great deal in it." "Oh, certainly," cried his faithful assistant. "No one can be really esteemed accomplished who does not greatly surpass what is usually met with it. A woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern languages to deserve the word, and besides all this, she must possess a certain something in her air and manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her address and expressions, or the word will be but half deserved." "All this she must possess," added Darcy, "and to all this she must yet add something more substantial, in the improvement of her mind by extensive reading. I am no longer surprised at your knowing only 6 accomplished women. I rather wonder now at your knowing any. Are you so severe upon your own sex as to doubt the possibility of all this? I never saw such a woman. I never saw such a capacity and taste and application and elegance as you describe." Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley both cried out against the injustice of her implied doubt, and were both protesting that they knew many women who answered this description, when Mr. Hurst called them to order, with bitter complaints of their inattention to what was going forward. As all conversation was thereby at an end, Elizabeth soon afterwards left the room. "Elizabeth Bennet," said Miss Bingley, when the door was closed on her, "is one of those young ladies who seek to recommend themselves to the other sex by undervaluing their own, and with many men, I dare say, it succeeds. But, in my opinion, it is a paltry device, a very mean art." "Undoubtedly," replied Darcy, to whom this remark was chiefly addressed. "There is a meanness in all the arts which ladies sometimes condescend to employ for captivation. Whatever bears affinity to cunning is despicable." Miss Bingley was not so entirely satisfied with this reply as to continue the subject. Elizabeth joined them again only to say that her sister was worse, and that she could not leave her. Bingley urged Mr. Jones being sent for immediately, while his sisters, convinced that no country advice could be of any service, recommended an express to town for one of the most eminent physicians. This she would not hear of, but she was not so unwilling to comply with their brother's proposal, and it was settled that Mr. Jones should be sent for early in the morning, if Miss Bennet were not decidedly better. Bingley was quite uncomfortable. His sisters declared that they were miserable. They solaced their wretchedness, however, by duets after supper, while he could find no better relief to his feelings than by giving his housekeeper directions that every attention might be paid to the sick lady and her sister. Thank you for listening to chapters 7 and 8 of Pride and Prejudice. I will follow up with the next 2 chapters soon. This has been Whispers Inc.